the iOS golf app. Our first webinar, in case you weren't able to make it for that one, was covering the optimizer feature, which is also available on both platforms. And if you haven't seen it yet, you can go to our blog at blog.trackman.com, and there you can click on webinar or search for webinar, and you'll find on the optimizer, and you can watch the full version of that there. This one will also be put online in a couple days, so if you need to review anything, then that will be available for you. And lastly, we will have 3 more webinars over the next 3 weeks. So they're all going to be at the same time on Monday afternoon, Danish time, and Monday morning, US time. So we'll have those next 3 weeks, and you can sign up just as you did for this one. So throughout the webinar today, go ahead and type in your questions, and then we have Henrik that's moderating the questions that are coming through, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll look at as many questions as we can and try and answer those for you. So let's go ahead and start. I'm just going to do a quick poll of everyone and see what kind of audience that we have today. So I'll go ahead and open that up, and if you can just go ahead and answer that quickly for me. Okay, and as you can see, the majority of us are instructors, coaches that are here today, but we have a few from the other groups as well. So again, thanks for joining us today. And now we'll go ahead and get started. So just to start out with, normalization, sometimes there's questions on what that actually means. And so I went and looked up the definition of what normalize is, and I think it fits very well. It's to bring something back to an expected state or condition, to make normal or to make conform, to standardize. So, those are the things that we're trying to do. We're trying to create a ball flight, a standardized ball flight that you can relate to and then make adjustments based off of that. And so, if we look at, well, what is the expected state or condition? And so what is it about our normalization feature that is that expected state or condition? Well, the 4 things that you need to be aware of is 1, no wind. So normalization always assumes that it's calm conditions, that there's no wind. So when you have normalized turned on, it's always going to show you that ball flight as if there was no wind, calm conditions. There's a certain temperature that's involved, and this is something that you can set on your own, as well as a certain elevation that you can set. And then with normalization, we're always using a premium golf ball. So we did a lot of testing on various premium golf balls, and then we took an average of all those golf balls, and we created what you would call maybe our TrackMan premium golf ball. So this is what we're expecting. No wind, a certain temperature, certain elevation, and a premium golf ball. So a big emphasis here is calm conditions. Calm conditions are always used when normalization is turned on. And as I just mentioned, you can go into the settings, both in the TPS software, but also in the iOS app, and you can adjust which altitude and which temperature that the ball flight's being calculated under. And we'll look at some examples later today on why that's important, but these are the things that you can change. You can change the altitude and you can change the temperature, and those are available in settings under general. And then from the premium ball standpoint, what's really important here is the aerodynamic properties of that premium golf ball. So, as I mentioned, we took a lot of premium golf balls and we measured their aerodynamic properties. So, we went out under calm conditions and we tested how these golf balls fly under calm conditions, under different spin rates, under different ball speeds. And so from there, we're able to see how does a golf ball behave under calm conditions and how do various golf balls behave, and then we kind of took an average of those. And so just in general, just a rule of thumb, as spin rate goes up and as ball speed goes up, that lift and drag are going to go up. I mean, that's going to be the same for, all golf balls out there. And, what we found was with all the premium golf balls that, yes, there are some variations between the different premium golf balls out there, but there's generally not huge differences between it from an aerodynamic standpoint. So what else do we need to know? So we've looked at, what are the weather conditions, and we've looked at the aerodynamic properties of the golf ball. But what else is it that we need to know in order to create a ball flight? Well, we need to look at the launch conditions. So we need to know the ball speed. We need to know the launch angle. We need to know the spin rate. And then also, from a horizontal standpoint, we need to know the launch direction and the spin axis. And if we know all those things, if we know the launch conditions, if we know the ball speed, if we know the launch angle, the spin rate, the launch direction, the spin axis, and then we know the temperature and the altitude, and we're going to assume that it's a premium golf ball as far as how that flies, and also that it's under conditions, then we can come up with a trajectory. So we need all that information, and if we have it, then we can create a trajectory for you, and we can create that normalized trajectory. So next, let's look at some of the fundamentals of the normalization feature, get a little bit more familiar with how it actually works behind the scenes now that we've looked at some of the basics. So first thing to know is that TrackMan always measures the actual trajectory. Now, this is, I guess you're really talking about outdoors here where you can see the full ball flight, but if you're outdoors, TrackMan's always going to measure that full trajectory. So if we notice here, we've got a ball that's fading and then fades across the line to the right-hand side of the target line. And then what TrackMan's going to do as far as how normalization works is what we're really concerned about is that first 30 yards of ball flight. And so in that first 30 yards of ball flight, TrackMan's going to be able to know what the ball speed is, what the launch angle is, spin rate, spin axis, and launch direction. And then in the software, when you turn on normalization, it's going to take this information from the actual shot. So it's going to take the information that came from that actual shot that you just hit, what's the ball speed of that shot, what's the launch angle of that shot, and so forth. And then it's going to take those other key factors, calm conditions, certain altitude, certain temperature, and the aerodynamics of a premium golf ball, and from that information, we can generate a normalized trajectory. And so this is that same shot that's now been normalized, and you can see that it was still fading, but it didn't quite fade across the line. It was really a wind that was blowing off of the left that pushed that ball to the right-hand side of the target line. And that's what normalization allows us to do. It allows us to see basically what that ball would have done under calm conditions. So there's some assumptions that we need to kind of keep in mind here. So when you're using the normalization feature, you're using a golf ball that generates a similar ball speed, a similar launch angle, and a similar spin rate compared to a premium golf ball. And if it doesn't, if it's a limited flight ball or a range ball or different things like that, that's where the ball conversion feature comes into play. And that's what we'll be covering next week. But for right now, all that we're looking at is the normalization part of it. And so, when we're looking at just normalization, we need to assume that it's going to be similar launch conditions to a premium golf ball. The other thing that we need to assume is that the aerodynamics of the various premium golf balls out on the market aren't dramatically different from one another. So if there happens to be, a premium ball out there that has drastically different aerodynamic properties, then there would be some differences compared to our normalized ball flight. But in general, we haven't seen anything that's too dramatically different when you're looking at the most popular premium golf ball brands out there. And then lastly, if we talk about indoors, and how does indoor normalization work compared to outdoor normalization? Well, the first thing that's consider here is that the ball flight models used indoors and outdoors are the same. So when I talked about that aerodynamic model that we get from the premium golf balls, that's what we're using to calculate the distances when you're indoors or hitting into a net that's a limited distance away from you. So the indoor ball flight is calculated based off the altitude and temperature that you've input into the settings. So just like when you can use normalization and you can change these things, well, when you first hit that shot when you're indoors, it's going to use this information. And so what normalization allows you to do when you're indoors, because it's calculating under calm conditions automatically because it can't measure the full ball flight. But what normalization allows you to do is it allows you to just to go in here and change these conditions and then see how that would have affected the ball flight compared to what it initially measured or calculated into the net. So it's a little bit different when you're talking about indoors and outdoors, but there's some similarities as well. So before we get into some examples, let me ask one more poll question here for you. And I'm curious, how often have you used normalization feature in the past? All right, thanks for answering that. So we can see there's some people that have never used it before. Some people use it a few times, almost every session. So pretty good mix there on what kind of usage that we've been getting out of normalization to this point. All right, so now we're going to go into some examples here. We just look at a very basic example, similar to the first one that we looked at. Here's a shot that has a lot of bend in the trajectory. Looks like a huge slice from this player, and the ball has landed almost 53 right of the target line. And the land angle's 34.5 and the carry's 195. Well, if we apply normalization to this shot here, we can see that it carried about 6 yards further. It's much closer to the target line, and it's actually a little bit flatter trajectory coming down at a shallower landing angle. So what we can kind of tell from here is that we go back, actual shot here, this is before normalization, so these are the actual numbers, and then after we increase the distance closer to the target line and flatter landing angle, we can basically tell from here that the wind was mainly off the left, but probably a little bit into us as well, because the actual trajectory came down a bit steeper and carried a little shorter. And so by normalizing and seeing this distance go up, we know that the wind must have been hurting a little bit, assuming that we're putting in the right altitude and temperature that was at the location that we were at. So now I've got a few different sample shots here that we're going to use for future examples. We've got a driver and 2 6-irons, the 6-iron from an LPGA player and the 6-iron from a PGA player. And just as a note, all 3 of these are optimized for mid-trajectory. So they're all pretty standard ball flights. They're not too high, not too low. They're right in the middle for these types of club speeds and ball speeds here. And so first what we're going to do is we're going to look at how trajectory affects things. All right, and so this is something that you can actually do in your software. You can go in there and you can have somebody hit shots, and you could have somebody go through and do a find your distance and hit every club in their bag. And then you have data on every single club in their bag. You have all their ball speeds, all their launch angles, all their spin rates. And then you can go in and you can play with the temperature and the altitude to see how things affect that particular person. And because what you'll see is that it is important to look at it on an individual case. There may be some very, very rough rules of thumb, but you really need to look at that particular person, get their data, and then play around with the temperature and the altitude and see how those things affect that player, because it will vary from player to player. And so if we look at it here, I've used 70 degrees Fahrenheit and gone up by 10 degrees. And so we can see the driver, 150 mile an hour ball speed. So it's a pretty good speed driver there, going to be right around 100 mile an hour club speed there. And we can see how temperature affects this person's distance. So it goes up a little bit more than a yard here, a little bit more than a yard here, and then so on. And then if we look at the LPGA 6 iron, a little bit more than a yard, a little bit more than a yard, and so on. And then you can also see the landing angles as well. So as the distance gets a little bit longer, the landing angle actually gets a little bit flatter. And then same thing for the PGA 6 iron here. And so maybe as a very rough rule of thumb is that you're probably going to get roughly a yard and a half to 2 yards per 10 degrees of change when you're looking at it from Fahrenheit scale. All right, so again, it's not always going to be that. It's much better if you have somebody go through like a find your distance and then you run the numbers for that particular person. But, if we just have to come up with something very rough, a yard and a half to 2 yards per 10 degrees of Fahrenheit. Next, we can look at altitude. So again, this is something that you can play around with in the software. So I've now, for this particular one, I've kept the temperature constant. And all that I've done here is just change the altitude. And so I've gone from sea level to 1,000 feet to 2,500 feet to 5,000 feet. And again, you can see how that affects the distance and how that affects the landing angle. And if we're looking at a very rough rule of thumb here, we're going to say 2 to 3 yards per 1,000 feet of elevation change. So, you're looking at a little bit less than a meter for every 300 meters in elevation change. But as the shot gets longer due to the elevation, it also becomes a flatter landing angle. So if you're thinking about clubs that are coming into the green, you might get more distance, but it's going to be coming in flatter, so it might be more difficult to hold the green or get it to stop as quickly as it normally would. Now if we look at a combination of temperature and altitude. So now we're changing both at the same time. And so what I've done here is I've gone through and I've increased here by 1,000 feet, the altitude, and then up to 2,500 and 5,000. But then I've found the temperature, decreasing the temperature so that basically the numbers don't change. And so what you kind of find out, again, another rough rule of thumb, is that 1,000 feet up in elevation is equivalent to losing about 15 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. So I went up by 1,000 here, and I went down by 15 degrees here, and you can see that the numbers didn't really change that much at all. And this is the same thing that I've done for these two as well. So if we went up to 5,000 feet and all the way down to 0 degrees, again, it doesn't change much from 0 feet and 75 degrees. Now, one thing to consider here is this is only looking at how air density affects the ball flight. So, if it's really that cold, if it's 0 degrees and the ball's been sitting outside, it's probably not going to react the same way. It's probably not going to have as much ball speed. I've seen that before with a player out on PGA Tour that the range balls had been sitting on the range and he wasn't getting as much ball speed as he normally expected. And then he picked some balls out of his bag that had been sitting in there and were warmer, same exact golf ball, and immediately we saw the ball speed pop up a little bit. So, it is one thing to consider. I mean, that day when we were doing the testing, it was in the 40s. So it was definitely pretty cool. But yeah, it's just something to consider if the range balls are sitting outside, that could have some effect on what the ball speed is. So, one thing just to keep in mind here is just be careful in generalizing, because if it's a mid-ball flight, then things are going to hold true. Those rules of thumb are going to hold pretty true. But if you get somebody with a strange ball flight, a really low ball flight, a really high ball flight, then it's not always going to behave necessarily the way that you think that it is. And again, that gets back to why that I said that it's important just to go on an individual case-by-case basis if you really want to be accurate with this information. So if we look at this particular case here, that we've got ball speed 165, so that's pretty high ball speed there. You're talking tour average ball speed, really low launch angle, and a pretty low spin rate here as well. And so if I start changing the altitude, sea level 1,000, 2,000 on up, if we look here, we're really not getting that much of an increase in carry distance. And then all of a sudden, at 4,000 feet, we hit 261.6, but we keep going up in elevation, and then the distance actually starts to drop. So, I mean, you're generally only going to see this at very high altitudes and with those extreme type of ball flights. But just be aware that just because altitude goes up doesn't mean that your distance is going to continue to keep going up and up and up. There's going to be some point of diminishing returns at some point. But if we look at the landing angle, that does continue to get flatter and flatter and flatter. So it's just something to be aware of. So again, I know I keep repeating this, but just so that we're all clear, again, normalization is considering premium golf ball as far as the aerodynamics and under calm conditions. So all of the examples that I've been looking at, premium golf ball aerodynamics and under calm conditions. So we were just looking at how altitude and temperature affect the ball flight. So an interesting thing, particularly a few weeks ago at the BMW, was how does elevation affect distance across the bag? And so this is a tour player that had gone through and hit all the clubs in their bag. And then I was able to run it through normalization and see how much distance would they really be getting at 5,000 feet. Now, Denver is a little bit more, 5,000, about 5,500 feet. Well, yeah, 5,300 feet is where Denver is. So a little bit more, but pretty much same thing as 5,000 feet here. So this kind of gives us an idea of maybe roughly how much distance that they were gaining at that altitude. And again, it's going to vary depending on the person. It's going to vary depending on their trajectory. But as we can see, 3-wood and long irons, 4.5%, 6% here. He had tested 2 different 3-woods, so 2 different trajectories. So you can see that 1.5% difference just between 2 different 3-woods can be pretty significant. 2-iron, then all of a sudden the 2-iron hardly got any additional carry at that altitude because it's going to be typically going to be a lower trajectory that doesn't get up in the air and take advantage of that altitude. And then you start to see it climb. And then it climbs up to about the 7-iron, and then it starts to go back down again. And so if we look at this as a graph, we can see this. So here's the 2 3-woods, then the 2-iron, and then it starts to go back up and up and up again, up to that 7-iron point, and then it starts to drop off again. And that's pretty typical. I mean, you're typically going to see that the largest jump in distance is generally kind of that 7, 8, 9 area is usually what I see. And then it's kind of a somewhat of a bell curve, and it's going to drop off on either side. And so, one thing that was interesting in Denver is I was talking to one of the announcers, and he'd been talking to the caddies, and he came up to me and he said that, the caddies are saying that it's going 10 and sometimes 12% further. But you can do that if their trajectory's a certain way. And what was really interesting from that week is that what we figured out is that what they do at that elevation is not what they normally do. So if we look at the PGA Tour averages for the year, so on the PGA Tour this year, the average launch angle for the entire year was 11.0 degrees. And then at Denver, just for that week, the average launch angle that week was a little over 12.5 degrees. So they actually were launching it slightly more than 1.5 degrees more than what they had done all year. And so what that does is basically by launching it higher, they're able to take advantage or take more advantage of that altitude. And so, they weren't normally just getting the 10% just because of the altitude. They were getting the 10% partially because of the altitude, but also because of the trajectory that they were hitting it at. So they were hitting it a lot higher in Denver, which was making the ball go that 10% or maybe even slightly more. It wasn't just because of the altitude. So just, end of the story is kind of, it's not just 10%. Don't expect it just to be 10% when you get to that kind of altitude. It depends really on the ball flight and what's going on there. And so the other side of the story is what that land angle is doing at elevation. So the land angle is getting a lot flatter. We can see on some of these, percentage-wise, extremely flat. And if we look at this from a graph perspective, we can see that they lose a lot percentage-wise from the land angle in those long clubs, and then not as much once they get to the wedges. And that was another thing that was interesting at the BMW, is that after the first round, a lot of the players were saying that it was the hardest greens that they had played all year and that they felt like it was set up like a US Open golf course. Well, the greens were, firm, but they weren't that firm. And what was really happening was that their ball was coming in a lot flatter than what they were used to, and so the ball was running out a lot more, and it was really had as much or more to do with what the landing angle was because of altitude than the hardness or firmness of the greens. So, it's definitely some things that you need to keep in mind when you're playing at those high altitudes and how that changes the ball flight. All right, so one more poll question here for you. So based on what you've seen so far today and what we're learning, do you feel like you're more likely to use normalization in the future? All right, so good to see that the majority of you feel like you'll use it more in the future. So hopefully this has been beneficial, but we have a few more things that we want to cover. Just wanted to ask that question real quickly. So now we're going to get into something a little bit more in depth here. We're going to start looking at how wind affects things. Now, we've talked about how normalization is always under calm conditions. So when you're using normalization, you can't affect the wind. You can't change what the wind is. You can't say it's a headwind or a tailwind or anything like that. But we can kind of look at some different scenarios here. So that's why I just wanted to separate this section. It's not something it's built into normalization, but it's not something that you can really play with from your standpoint. But I just wanted to show you how important it is knowing what wind does to the ball flight. So if you go to trackmangolf.com/newsletter, in January of 2014 issue, we wrote an article under TrackMan University talking about normalization and wind and how that affects things. So, it might be a good idea at some point to go there, download that newsletter, and then just take a look at that. And this is just one of the examples from the newsletter that talks about, a train moving and a car moving on top and your hands outside the window and the forces that you feel on your hand and kind of how that relates to what the golf ball does through the air. So let's take a few looks here. Here we got a PGA Tour 6-iron, and we've got calm conditions, a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, a 20-mile-an-hour headwind, a 10-mile-an-hour tailwind, and a 20-mile-an-hour tailwind. And so I've got the exact same launch conditions for all of these. So it's the same shot. Again, it's kind of a mid-ball flight. And then we can look at, under calm conditions, that ball would have peaked out at 101 feet. So maybe it's just a slightly higher ball flight. And then the land angle would have been 48 degrees. Under a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, max height goes up to 114. Carry goes down from 184 to 166. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic difference right there. That's a distance loss of 18 yards into a 10-mile-an-hour headwind. Now, the one thing that I need to make clear here is that this is a constant 10-mile-an-hour headwind. So this is saying that it's a 10-mile-an-hour headwind from the time the ball leaves until the time the ball hits the ground, which is, maybe not what you feel. Usually it seems like people kind of tend to say what the gusts are, and then that's how they judge the wind. So this is a constant 10-mile-an-hour headwind or a constant 20-mile-an-hour headwind. So it may be a little bit more severe than when you think of what you consider a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, but interesting to see how much that really affects the ball flight, how much it affects the height, and then also the landing angle. You can see how it gets a lot steeper, it goes higher, and it goes a lot shorter. And then if we look at the 20-mile-an-hour and then how the tailwind affects it, well, if we stick with the 10-mile-an-hour first, the headwind makes you lose 18 yards, and a tailwind makes you gain 14 yards, assuming that you have the same launch conditions for the same shot. So you lose more than you gain. And then what's really interesting is that as you get higher and more wind, under a 20-mile-an-hour headwind, you lose almost twice as much as what you gain with that same tailwind. So as the wind gets stronger and stronger, it affects you a lot more when you're hitting into it than it does when you're hitting with the wind. And so again, just something to keep in mind, and maybe let your students know when they're playing course management wise that that headwind, they actually need to take more club into the headwind than that same kind of difference when they're dealing with a downwind shot. We just look at an LPGA Tour, so I just wanted to show you a shot that's at a different speed, just so you can see that it's not just because it's a high-speed player, somebody that hits it a long way. It also affects somebody that hits it a little bit shorter as well. So same thing here. We've got the same shot, normal carry with the 6-iron, 152 under calm conditions, coming down at 46 degrees into that 10-mile-an-hour headwind. That shot's going to lose 13 yards, where 10-mile-an-hour tailwind, it's only going to gain 9 yards. And then again, once you get up to that kind of 20-mile-per-hour number into the wind, twice as much as what you're going to actually gain from being downwind. And then again, also when you're downwind, it's going to come in a lot flatter, so you got to really watch how much that ball is going to release once it hits the green. So how about a driver into a wind? Let's look at this example here. And what I've done here is I've looked at two different shots, because it's always an interesting topic to talk about, should you change your trajectory when you're into a headwind? And so if we look at here, we've got a high launch, low spin shot, 14 degrees, 2100 spin rate. And then we've got a low launch, low spin shot. So both of these, same ball speed, one's just high launch, low spin, and the other's low launch, low spin. And so if we look up here at the top, if we go from calm to a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, we're losing about 18 yards here. The same shot, the low shot, well, it never carried as far. So the high launch, low spin carried 294 versus the low launch, low spin carried 266. So, I mean, there's a huge difference in the initial carry distance under calm conditions. But what we see is we don't lose as much because of that 10-mile-an-hour headwind. And so it's just kind of interesting to look at this chart and kind of see, how much headwind does there have to be before it should make you really start thinking about changing your trajectory. And if we look at this, if we look at total yards here, well, once we get up to that 20-mile-per-hour constant headwind, total distance with the high launch, low spin shot is going to be about 262 yards. That low launch, low spin, 256. So we're getting pretty close to a break even here into that 20-mile-an-hour wind. We go to a 30-mile-an-hour wind, now they're almost the same. So it has to be a pretty strong wind in order for, theoretically for you to change that launch condition. And then here, again, we're looking at low launch and low spin. So this is the best case scenario when you're hitting into that headwind. if you are going to change things. You wouldn't want to go low launch and high spin. So that's why I picked this shot, is because it's actually best case scenario. So, again, has to be pretty strong headwind before you start seeing that break even point. But one thing to consider here is that the longer the ball is in the air, the more that the wind can affect it as far as offline. So, if you've got a ball that starts curving offline into a headwind, then it's going to push it even more offline because it's in the air longer. Now, if you're always hitting it dead straight, dead down the center of the fairway, then I would say that just keep hitting your normal high launch, low spin. But if you're somebody that has dispersion problems and not a lot of control with the driver, then maybe it does start making sense to change your trajectory and lower it a little bit, just so the ball's not in the air as long and it won't go as far offline. But if you're a good driver of the golf ball, I wouldn't be as concerned about dramatically changing what your launch conditions are. Same thing we've done here. Now we've looked at it for a 6-iron, and we've looked at a mid-launch shot and a low launch shot. So we've gone from 15.7 degrees all the way down to 11.1. So if you've ever tried changing your launch angle by that much, you'll know that that's quite a big difference in launch angle there. And then you would expect spin rate to drop as well, because this person's probably going to have a lower spin loft, so they're going to have less spin. So again, if we start looking at what happens here, from 165, 169, so pretty similar carries. This one comes down a bit steeper because it's the mid ball flight versus low ball flight comes down a little bit flatter. But as we start to move down here, 150, that dropped 15 yards between those two, where this one only dropped 11 yards because of the lower ball flight. And it's still, under 50 degrees. That's still a pretty good landing angle here at 47.8. Where 55.5, that's starting to get pretty steep. If we go into the 20-mile-an-hour headwind, now that landing angle is really starting to get steep, and it's only carried 131 yards, whereas the low ball flight, still quite a steep landing angle, but not as steep, and now it's carried, about 12 yards further. So when you start looking at, the irons, that can start to make a pretty big difference in as far as what type of trajectory that you might want to play, so that you can not lose as much distance and then also kind of control your landing angle. So it's fun to play around with the wind and kind of see how those things affect your trajectory, and then how those things may affect your decision as far as what type of ball flight to play. So next week, what we're going to be doing is we're going to get into ball conversion. And so, ball conversion is going to convert whatever golf ball that you're hitting, whatever that golf ball type is, so from a range ball to a premium ball, and then it's going to automatically use the normalization feature. So I wanted everybody to get a good understanding of what normalization is, how it works, look at some examples, and then next week we'll be able to look at ball conversion and then how that fits into the picture. So we're actually done now for the presentation part, and if you give me just a minute here, we're going to get some questions going. So if you've been typing them in, or if you have any questions now, that you can type them in, and we'll try and get through a few here over about the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, all right, let me start looking through some of these questions here. So first question is asking about humidity and relative humidity. Is that a factor in ball flight? It is a factor, but it's a pretty small factor. I mean, if you change from 0% humidity to 100% humidity, you're typically only going to see about a yard or two change. So we used to have that in the original TrackMan software with normalization. We had it where you could change the humidity, but it just doesn't play that big of a factor, so we decided to remove it just to kind of alleviate any confusion there. Now, the one thing that is interesting about humidity is that although it's kind of thought that higher humidity, it feels heavier, the air feels heavier in higher humidity situations, that actually higher humidity will make the ball go fractionally further. So it's usually the reverse of how most people think about it. High humidity, the ball will actually go fractionally further, but again, you're talking 1 or 2 yards, so it's really not going to make that much difference, or that you really need to be that concerned about what the humidity is. Yeah, just one comment that somebody made here about the sometimes you have to be a little careful with some people that do club fitting that I mean you can kind of cheat the system in a sense if you want to make the ball go really far. I mean you can go and you can put in a high altitude and it's going to make the ball go further. I mean I don't think that hopefully trying to give people the most accurate results as possible, but that is something to be aware of that can happen. Question about the landing angle being flatter and higher altitude. It just has to do with the thin air, as you would say. So the air is thinner, there's less resistance, and because there's less resistance, that means that there's less lift and drag. And since the ball's not lifting up as high, then it's not going to come down as steep. So it's really just due to the thin air there and that there's less resistance on the golf ball. And so it's just going to create that flatter trajectory. Somebody asked about the M/S and what that stands for. That's just meters per second. So I guess that's fairly common in other parts of the world as far as looking at the wind speed. So instead of miles per hour, that's just meters per second. And just so that you know, there's one question about the graphs. This will be available online. The video form will be able to, so you'll be able to go back and watch the video and then see any of the numbers and graphs in that video. Um, Good question about a crosswind and affecting spin axis. So a crosswind, the way that we measure the spin axis of the golf ball, we look at kind of that first 30 yards of ball flight, and then we see how the golf ball's curving, and then from there we're able to come up with what the spin axis is. And so just so that you're aware, if you do have a strong crosswind, that will start to affect the spin axis a little bit as far as how we report it. And where you have to really be more concerned about that is with lower ball speeds. So at higher ball speeds, you're not going to see really that much effect or as much effect because you're looking at kind of the comparison of the wind speed versus the ball speed. So the closer that the ball speed and wind speed are to each other, then you're going to see a little bit more effect. But when you've got big differences like a 150-mile-an-hour ball speed and then a 20-mile-an-hour crosswind, you're not going to see as big of a difference or as much effect there. But that's something I'll see if we can get more information for you there as far as how much exactly that is. Good question about tour players and how they are preparing at altitude. It was a really interesting conversation that I had at the BMW because once I started to explain how some of these things worked, the commentator kind of thought back to his playing days and started to say, wow, okay, that starts to make sense because, one thing that we discussed was these players are out there. These tour players are generally very visual people. And if you've watched one of our videos with Jason Duffner, is that he really pays attention to what the height of his trajectories are. And so he knows just from using TrackMan a lot that 95 feet is about where his shot's apex. And then he's gotten accustomed to just what that looks like when he's hitting those shots. So once he gets out to high altitude, even though he didn't play in Denver, those players are going to see their trajectory start to lower because of the thin air and what we talked about. And so, you know, is it a natural reaction, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, that they start hitting the ball a little bit higher, launching it a little bit higher because they want to see the ball flight at a certain height? And so then they start hitting it a little bit further. But then does that affect their mechanics and different things like that? So it was quite interesting to have that discussion and then also see the results from on course that the launch angles were changing that much. I mean, 1.5 degrees is quite a big difference when you're looking at it compared to the overall year's numbers. So I don't think that as many players are probably aware that they're actually changing their swing as much as they potentially are in those conditions. So it's something that everybody needs to be aware of because they may be changing something in their swing and causing problem when they don't even realize it, but it's just because they're subconsciously trying to get their ball flight back to where they're used to seeing it. A couple questions here about rain. We don't actually have any data on rain. I mean, it's going to, create more resistance. So, I mean, it's going to slow the ball down faster. It's probably going to keep the golf ball a little bit lower and things like that. So I would expect it to go a little bit shorter. I would expect the height to be a little bit lower, but don't have any good tests that we've done as far as how much exactly that rain affects the ball flight. Just looking through a few more questions here. So there's a question about when hitting into a net, do you need at least 30 yards of ball flight? No, you don't. I mean, that's just where we switch from a software standpoint, you could say, that we consider indoor versus outdoor, and that's just kind of the limit that we've set. So, we consider anything less than 30 yards of ball flight to be an indoor setting, and then we consider everything more than about 30 yards of ball flight to be considered an outdoor setting. So that's just kind of the number that we've set internally as far as what we consider indoor, what we consider outdoor. But you do need at least 30 yards of ball flight for us to measure the spin axis. And so that's a good point to bring up here based off of that question, that when you are in an indoor setting, so if you do have that less than 30 yards of ball flight and you're hitting into a net, that if you're in indoor setting, we calculate the spin axis based off of club delivery because we don't have enough information on the ball flight in order to measure what that spin axis is. So it is something that's important to keep in mind that if you are in that indoor setting, that we are calculating the spin axis based off of the club path and the attack angle and things like that. So you're not going to see gear effect show up in an indoor setting. You're only going to see that when you're in an outdoor setting or when you have at least 30-yard ball flight. There's a question about the landing elevation, so basically an uphill or a downhill range. And so TrackMan is always carry flat, whether it is a measured shot. So if you don't have normalization turned on, if normalization is turned off, we always give a measured value of carry flat. So from whatever kind of elevation that you're hitting from, if you had an imaginary line that went straight out, wherever that ball flight crosses that point is the carry distance that we give you. And that's going to be the same for the normalized carry distance as well. So always the only carry number that you can get from TrackMan, no matter what setting is turned on or turned off, is that carry flat number. So regardless if your range is uphill or downhill or whatever it is, you're always going to get what we call carry flat. So the change in the elevation or your range isn't going to affect any of the TrackMan data. But it is something that you have to keep in mind, once you start going out and playing the golf course, that if you have a hole that's downhill, it gets a little bit more complicated when you start looking at the landing angle and then how much, because of the landing angle, that the ball is going to carry further because of the uphill or downhill or shorter, those sort of things. But as far as TrackMan goes, we're always going to report that carry flat number. There's a question that kind of relates to the air pressure. So another thing when you talk about atmospheric pressure, it depends on what website or what country that you're in, but some look at it in ATM, some look at it in inches of mercury, and then I forget exactly hectares Pascal or millibars is a more international one. But again, the air pressure is pretty similar to humidity in that it doesn't have a huge effect on how things are going to change. We do automatically take into account, so as you go up in altitude, there's an equation that shows how the air pressure changes. So when you change the altitude, we automatically adjust the air pressure for that altitude. So that is one thing that we do take into account. But other than that, as far as different weather systems coming through and how that affects the air pressure, it's not a huge effect. It's similar to the humidity in that it only changes at a couple yards. So it's not really something that you have to be that worried about. And again, it's something we had in the beginning, but it's not something that we have there that you can adjust anymore. And that's a few other questions, but I think it looks like that's probably about all the time that we have for today. If you have any other questions, feel free to email us, and we'll try and get back to you. But we'll be putting this, online. We thank you for your participation, and hope that you're able to join us again next week when we cover ball conversion, and then the following weeks after that. So if you have any feedback, please let us know. But thanks again for being here, and we'll see you next week.